friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started. Hey, welcome back to the Rewind podcast. My name is Rachel. I am your host again this week. With me, I've got Pastor Derek preaching in Cambridge. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Rach.
And Pastor Daryl, welcome back. You were in
Hello.
Kitchener, obviously preaching.
Yeah, I was. Yep.
Okay, so if you listened to us last week, we were prepping for Super Bowl.
Pre-Super Bowl.
Pre-Super Bowl. We were talking about it. Kirk's not here to side with me today.
No, he would feel he'd have similar emotions to you.
Yeah.
Rich.
Daryl, quick question.
Yeah.
Were you rooting for anyone? Did you watch the Super Bowl?
I did not watch the Super Bowl.
Okay.
Okay, so there we go. Let's
That's
just close that off.
Okay.
Okay, it's a two-person conversation now.
I looked up the score a couple times.
But you weren't invested. You didn't have a team you were rooting for.
No, I wanted a certain team to lose. So
Were you eating snacks?
That's going to be my question. So you can tell us what you ate on Sunday. But
There you go. Yeah.
Derek, you won because you were the only one in this room last week who was cheering for KC.
Yeah.
So
But I wasn't really. I was not
No.
cheering hard for KC. I felt like in some ways we were all losers either way.
we all lost. We all lost. But hey, we probably enjoyed some great snacks. So that's what I want to know.
Yeah.
What did you eat for Super Bowl?
Me?
Yeah.
I had some taquitos with salsa.
Nice.
Nice.
Had a little bit of pizza and some bacon wrapped jalapeno poppers.
Excellent choices.
Yeah.
Daryl, did you eat good snacks on Sunday?
You know what? I
Or lunch?
I decided to go out to a restaurant.
Okay.
Went to the Keg.
Nice.
Had some.
Daryl was the only person in the restaurant.
It was a very empty restaurant. That's
You had
okay.
top-notch service.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Love
It was our anniversary. So.
Listen,
there you go.
now you get lots
Yeah.
of. You
Yeah.
totally get it passed.
Yeah, no football on the anniversary or any other day.
I was gonna say, or any other day for Daryl, but
But especially that day. Well, glad you had a great dinner.
Yeah, it was great. It was a great
and that
day.
actually turns out really well. I mean, like because you don't care about football,
Yeah.
having that whole restaurant to yourself is great.
it did determine a little bit of where we're going to go. Because I'm like, okay, what restaurant's just not going to draw a football crowd? And the Cake. Yeah, that's
Yep.
just...
Was there people in the bar watching the game?
we went a little bit earlier, so
Okay.
no game was on.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, they just had some hockey on. Like, that was it. So
Okay.
yeah, nothing football related. You go somewhere else for that, I would say. A different type of restaurant.
Okay.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
Rachel, what did you have for snacks?
We had classic nachos. You can't.
Oh, that's a good
not
one. You
Watch
can't go wrong with
football and
that.
Not eat nachos. And then I made some cheesy sourdough bread.
Is that when you cut your finger?
That is when I cut my finger. I was rushing. I wanted to watch the pregame stuff. I love that. And so as I was slicing my bread, I'm also trying to get there so I don't miss any of the performances and cut my finger. It was fine. It's fine now. But we dipped it in like a spinach dip. So it was...
Your finger or the bread?
Sorry, let's
My
clarify.
finger. Okay, now dip it in some spinach dip. Everybody enjoy.
This
Wow,
a little...
and you still served it?
A
Wow,
little
that's
knowledge
gross.
for you. Putting a bleeding finger in spinach dip actually cures it.
And also just wonderful for those who are partaking.
Extra flavor.
Yeah, secret ingredient of the Nichols spinach dip recipe.
I didn't cut it all off, so it didn't get on the bread or in the dip. Just in case anyone was wondering, everything was still
Your fingers are still attached.
everything's still
Yeah.
there. No one ate.
Your finger.
Oh man, let's get this back on track. That was the highlight of our night. That's what happened. Okay, this week we were in week 2, Ecclesiastes. The sermon title was called "The More You Know," and there were some listeners from last week who knew immediately the GI Joe lingos or jingle. So
It's not just G.I. Joe. It was NBC. Did
that too.
did the more you know, and then the star goes across the
Both.
screen.
So we had people who knew what we were referencing. Would you start, Daryl, I'll let you go first this time. Give us an overview of the message, your main takeaway for this week of study.
Yeah. So in this passage, it's really focusing in on knowledge and wisdom, and also dealing with this idea he calls madness and folly. And I just described it as foolishness overall. And so paradoxically, our world is obsessed with these two pursuits. On the one side, a lot of our world is just based around this pursuit of knowledge. So really focus on that and talk about how just merely the pursuit of knowledge doesn't get us where we want to go. And then giving up and just looking at just foolishness, just, okay, life is meaningless then. That too doesn't lead to a fulfilled life. And really just everything kind of boils down to this one central idea that that our lives can't be focused in on the things that are outside of our control. We can't control everything in the world around us. The world is too complex. And so we need something outside of the world. And so jumped ahead to chapter 2, verse 26, where it begins talking about how God is the one who gives us the gift of wisdom, knowledge, and joy. And so in that, we're rooted in this idea that our knowledge of God is the thing that actually gives our life meaning and significance.
Great. And Derek, where did you go with your message? Were you at the same spot?
I started us with a question in the morning to say, hey, we're gonna see this morning whether knowledge is the thing that is worth investing our lives in pursuing. And so we began to explore what the teacher explored, walked through his thinking, and came to the point and realization of the fact that knowledge is a good gift, but it can't be an ultimate goal, can't be the thing that we invest our entire lives in pursuing. And then we looked at the fact that there is a knowledge that's worth pursuing because it's the only knowledge that can ultimately save us from the end that all of us face, no matter how foolish or wise we are. It's the knowledge of Christ that makes all the difference.
Yeah, and you both landed in some really great spots. So the joy of knowing God, but also the necessity of knowing Jesus ultimately. Is there anything that stood out to you as you studied or prepared this week, or anything that you might have hoped to have spent more time on, but were limited because of just timing of the service?
Yeah, there's one thing that I didn't spend a whole lot of time on is verse 13, where it says God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. And that's one of those verses that just kind of jumps out at you. It's kind of this maybe a cynical point of view that the author of Ecclesiastes is talking about. And I just found that fascinating, where he's kind of speaking with a little bit of hyperbole here. He's obviously he's not against God, but he's kind of lamenting, just kind of complaining in this passage that he's done all this pursuit of knowledge and it just keeps on not landing him there. And I find that interesting as a biblical author, that he would use a phrase like that he would use that type of language. And so that's something where I feel like we could really unpack that and talk a lot about this idea of lamenting to God and how we can do that, and what's the appropriate ways that we can lament and what's the inappropriate ways that we can lament. There's boundaries to this, but reading a passage like this, I mean, sometimes our way of lamenting to God can come across as a little bit shocking. And so I touched on it a little bit, but I feel like we could talk forever about this idea of how do we actually lament to God when life is not going the way that we think it should.
Okay, so for those who are listening who are like, yeah, that resonates with me, give them like one sentence of something hopeful that if they're in that season that they could practically use.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think that this passage shows us that God is able to hear and handle our laments. God is able for us to turn to him and say, life is unfair. And so we shouldn't hide away from that. We can turn to him. And we actually have an entire Equip class on lament. And so Pastor Kirk taught that class. It's online, so our listeners can just go on there and listen to it and really unpack this idea of what do you do when life is unfair. So that's where I would point to, because it is so important that we learn how to speak to God in those moments. We don't have to sugarcoat it, and we don't have to turn away from it, but instead we can speak to God honestly how we feel in these moments.
Yeah, that's great. And God knows our emotions. He can handle it all because he did create them and us. So yeah, go for it. Thank you for that. Derek, what about you? What would you have liked to maybe spend more time on, or
Yeah, so
what stood out to you?
there was. I'll start with something that stood out to me, and I spent some time on it in the message. We're actually going to come back to it at Good Friday, so this is going to be a text that we look at a lot on Easter weekend. But in verse 15, where the teacher says, "What is crooked cannot be straightened; what is lacking cannot be counted." That verse has captured me the entire time since the first time I read it prepping for this series, that there is something in the heart of every human being that recognizes there's a brokenness in the world that we can't seem to be able to put back together. And I just encounter that with people. And I think it's a great point for us to start when we talk about how do you engage people in spiritual conversations? How do you see open doors to the gospel? Recognizing that there is this human reality that I think everybody feels, that there's injustice, that there's things that are unfair, that the world is crooked, that there is this idea that there is a straightness to the world. But where do we come up with that? Why is that in us? So that kind of just has been resonating with me a lot in thinking through that and thinking through what that means from an apologetic standpoint in engaging people with the gospel. The thing I wish I could have spent a little bit more time on was over in chapter 2, when we talked about the fact that wisdom is valuable, knowledge is valuable. It's better to be knowledgeable, it's better to have wisdom than to be foolish and ignorant. What we're going to see oftentimes as we walk through Ecclesiastes is God gives us some good gifts under the sun, and it's really important to recognize those good gifts. Where the danger runs in, and where what we're so tempted to do so many times is we see something good and we take that good thing and we treat it as our God. We treat it as the thing that we're going to pursue and we're going to live for. But yeah, like, it's better that you're not ignorant in so many different ways. And like I said, when you talk about wisdom in Scripture and how the Bible thinks about wisdom, there's a moral aspect to it. So it's not that there's no value in living with a sense of morality, a strong sense of right and wrong, but it's still not enough to save you, right? You're still going to end up in the same place as the person who lives a life of foolishness, a life of immorality.
Right. And I think some of our questions coming up that were texted in will kind of dive deeper into that. So I'm not going to go there anymore right yet, because I think we're going to get there later. I want to start with this one question that came through from our text line. If you are listening and you ever have questions that you want to put forward, you can always text them into...
Do you want me to say it?
Well, I know the number, but I forgot the code.
Rewind.
Oh, you can text rewind.
Yeah.
And then our text number, 226-212-7117. Mark that down. If you haven't saved it to your phone, do that now. So if you ever have a question, you're like, hey, I'm thinking about this, send it in. And we'll try and answer it as we can. So this question came in. When God responded so well to Solomon's request for wisdom and not the death of his enemies, this was in direct contrast to King David, who was a man after God's own heart. This should have given Solomon a huge advantage. He had a heart never touched by battle and killing, no enemies that needed defending or defeating. Add to that wisdom and discernment to see the world for what it is. So having so many advantages, why did Solomon fail so greatly in following the Lord?
Yeah, I actually, it's interesting. And I think this goes to a little bit of what I just said. When we are given good things, when we don't have to struggle, when we aren't forced to suffer, I think that often leads us to places where we turn good things into ultimate things, where we lose focus and lose sight, where we often struggle in our faith. I think it's really interesting. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you go back to God speaking to Moses, and I'll try and find the reference for this to give you a little bit later, but God warns Moses. He says, when you go into the land and things are so good for you, here is what you're going to have to be aware of. This is when you're going to be tempted to pursue other gods and to turn away from me. There is a sense in which we are at our most vulnerable when we have received the most good from God and been the least tested. And I know this actually will tie into some of the other questions that we're going to talk about, but I really think that that's it. Is Solomon, in some ways, Solomon asked for the right things. He was so blessed that he lost sight of the blesser in the midst of the blessings.
Yeah, he forgot to remember.
Yeah, he forgot to remember. That's it.
Yeah. I would say what's interesting. So Solomon, he said to the Lord, like, this is what his request is for wisdom and knowledge, right? And as this question says, in contrast to King David, who is a man after God's own heart, Solomon didn't. His great request wasn't that he would live a holy life, that he would, it wasn't a pursuit after righteousness. It was this pursuit of wisdom, and wisdom often, and I talked about this a little bit on Sunday, that wisdom often comes through experiencing hardships. And so you kind of go through difficult moments, and the hard thing is that we would like to avoid certain hard moments in our lives. So I said this on Sunday, like, there's some hard things I went through in my 20s, down in my 30s. I wish I could go back and tell myself, hey, don't live this way. Like, but I don't think I wouldn't even believe myself. Like, if I could even do that. And what the author of Ecclesiastes is doing, like, he's lived through this, and now he can say to us, hey, I've lived through all these experiences, so don't go down this path, because I've seen that it only leads to hardship and to pain. And so I feel like Solomon, who are not sure if Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, likely not, but he did ask for wisdom. But part of this is he was going to walk through challenging moments along the way, and now he can kind of share with us what he has learned through this whole process. Now, for us, what we should do is not live through that experience, but to take the knowledge, the wisdom that he's giving to us. But now here's the challenge. Like, are we willing to receive that? Or are we still going to say, nah, I still need to live through it? Kind of like, they say money won't make you happy, but I sure would like to give that a shot. Just give me, let me win the lottery, and I'll see how much happiness I can get out of that, right? Like, you can hear this, but will you actually take it to heart? And I think that's part of the challenge of reading a wisdom literature like this, is like, will we actually listen to the wisdom that is being said here?
Right. So I have two questions that kind of they flow out of the same kind of thought you have there, Daryl. I don't know which one is better to ask first, so we'll ask one, and then if it builds into the other, if not, I'll re-ask it. So when we're asking God for knowledge in the same sense like Solomon did, is the outcome then similar to that, like when we pray for patience? So, oftentimes as young parents, people are like, oh, you pray for patience. And then you're like, why the heck did I pray for patience? Because you have to walk through those trials. So is praying for knowledge in the same kind of way as praying for patience, that like, in order to get the knowledge, you actually have to go through some stuff to come out wise on the other end?
So I think it could be. So I'm gonna look at two things. So I'm gonna look at the experience of Solomon in 1 Kings 3, and then I want to go forward to the book of James. So in 1 Kings 3, the reason Solomon asks for wisdom is because he says, I am young and I want to know right from wrong and how to justly manage this great people that you have called to yourself, God. I think if you're looking for wisdom for what is right and what is wrong, one of the beautiful things is that God gives us his word and he gives us his spirit if we're followers of him, right? So you don't have to make all of the mistakes to figure out what is moral and immoral. God has given us his word to give us that wisdom. And I would look to, again, in James chapter 1, where we're told that if anyone lacks wisdom, just ask God and he gives generously without finding fault. There doesn't seem to be there a sense in which God is wanting to withhold from us an understanding of how to please him and make that difficult to figure out. But there is knowledge and wisdom that comes through suffering. And we've talked about this before, but in 2 Corinthians, the idea that the God of all comfort who comforts us in affliction, that we may comfort those as well who are walking through similar circumstances. So then there is an acquired wisdom and knowledge of life experience that God gives us as well that is part of wisdom, so that we can better empathize and minister to those. So I think both are true. I think there's a truth to both of them. There is a certain amount of wisdom that is only available through going through struggles and hard times. But there is a wisdom that God has given to people in order to save us from having to go through a certain amount of difficulties and tough times. And in Proverbs and in Ecclesiastes, what you frequently see is that the person who is speaking wants especially to give that wisdom to young people, so they don't have to bang their head and just deal with the foolishness that ultimately usually comes from youth.
So with that, I wonder if it's wisdom can be given, but it is the hardships of life, similar to back to this question of patience. It's the hardships of life that now reveals it. And not just reveals it, but would you agree, it doesn't just reveal it, but it can also be a perfecting of it.
It refines it.
Refining.
I think refining both of our, I think that goes to the idea of refining of faith.
Yeah.
Your faith is tested, it's hardened, and the wisdom that you have and the trust that you have in God is proven.
Right. And I mean, like, just like children that we probably live with, and you're like, don't do that. Yep. I know better. And you know that those kids are going to do it anyways, even though the wisdom of mom and dad are a little bit.
There is a foolishness of youth. In fact, if you go through Proverbs, there's different types of foolishness. One is strictly that. It's the foolishness of being a child and not knowing any better. Mm-hmm. Then there is the fool who is the mocker, who chooses to think that they know better than God and the ways of God. And then there is the fool who is choosing to be a fool, knowing what is right and what is wise, and choosing to walk away from it and pursue folly instead.
It is a vast amount of fools that we probably all fall under.
Two of those have a sense. There is a moral aspect to their foolishness, right? The mocker and the fool who just chooses to disobey God and walk in folly. Those fools are treated differently and are understood differently than the fool who is just foolish because they haven't been given wisdom. They don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And what's interesting, Derek, with what you just said there is, and I forget where I read this, but it was talking about this idea that one of the reasons why kind of like older generations struggle with like the younger generation is because they have gone through these experiences. They have this wisdom now, and they really want the younger generation to know better and to do better. And it's really from this heart of like, oh, I can help you to avoid all these hardships. But there's this disconnect. They can't communicate it in the way that the younger generation is going to listen to it. Yeah. And then they butt heads. And you wonder, and so the simple view of it is like, oh, just older people don't like young people. That's not it. Like often they deeply do, but there's this disconnect where the younger person just isn't listening, and then you can have this conflict. And that's where I feel like it's very, very important for all generations to be aware of this, and hopefully through that, as different literatures come out on different generations, we can bypass some of the hurts that can come along the way, because we certainly don't want different generations to miss what each other are saying to each other, especially those who have the experience and wisdom that they would like to pass to a younger generation.
Can I speak a word into this?
You speak, and I want to share something that we're watching happen here.
This is like this will make Blair's day if she ends up listening, because I was reading an article on parenting by J.D. Greer today.
Oh, and she loves that.
and he was sharing that one of the greatest parenting lessons that he learned was, especially, and this is especially for those of us who have teenage kids, and I'm there right now, is there comes a time where things shift from I can giving direct instruction, trying to control my child's behavior is no longer helpful. But you have to trust at that point that you have planted enough seed, and all you can do is try and water those seeds, and the best way that you can water them is through prayers and asking the Holy Spirit to bring to fertilize those seeds and bring growth out of them.
I'm gonna take a hard turn back to what Daryl was talking about, multi-generational kind of relationships. Because I just had someone this morning share with me how they're seeing the benefit of it. So our women's Equip class has a vast amount of women and come from all ages and stages. And one of the groups said to me, this is, they're walking through one of the best studies, not necessarily because of what we're studying, but because of this group dynamic that they're facing. And they are a true multi-generational table. And so there are women who are grandparents now who are at tables with women who are just new and younger moms and all the in-betweens. And so they're doing they're imparting wisdom, but they're also learning from other generations. And I think we often get lost in that we think that we know better than other generations or whatever it is, but there is a beauty and a necessity of sharing in community in that way.
Yeah. And I wonder if this is what's happening with the women around these tables is what the teacher is doing in Ecclesiastes is he doesn't just boil it down to like, here's some simple principles, but he shares what he experienced. And I wonder if the wisdom in this literature, the wisdom of this passage is that he's not just telling you what to do, but he's explaining his experience. And I wonder if that's why these tables with this women's study is going so well, is because it's not just merely, no one's like lecturing each other. They're sharing, hey, here's the joys and the hardships that I've gone through over my years. And that's how that information can be shared is typically through stories.
Yeah.
So
I would think that's probably part of it.
Yeah. I
don't know the ins and outs because I'm not directly sitting with them, but it's just one of those things that happens and you lose sight of it if you're not actively participating in it. Okay. We're talking about parenting. We got some questions about how to parent. Derek, this comes out. You made, I think
at the end of my message, I gave some application to parents, just a brief word of exhortation to parents.
Yeah. So a question here is, as a parent, how do we help our children practically pursue knowledge of Jesus while balancing responsibilities like schoolwork, chores, etc.?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that we need to do that is different than what the culture around us wants to do, and maybe different than how we grew up, is to stop compartmentalizing Jesus. Jesus is the reason why, like one of the, and I had fantastic parents who loved Jesus, and I'm so thankful for the way that they invested in me. I think one of the things I wish that I would have known is to see the connect between, hey, excel in school, because this is one of the ways that you worship Jesus.
Yeah.
You give him your best. You're not doing this for yourself. You're not doing this to get a better paycheck. You're doing this because Jesus is worth your best. And when you pursue things with excellence, that points towards a God who is excellent and who gives us good things. The same thing with our work. I mean, this is one of the, I've talked about this a few times, but one of the great treasures of the Reformation was the breaking down of the wall between the sacred and secular, and Martin Luther saying, hey, like, listen, this is a priesthood of all believers. Everything that we do has meaning. Everything we do can be an act of worship. And so helping our kids think through a Jesus lens, where Jesus is the lens through which they think about all things. I think it's really important that we understand that we model to our kids, right? That Jesus is priority one, and everything else flows out of getting that priority correct. My relationship with God is the thing that all the other things are organized under. It's the organizing principle for my life. So it's not one priority competing with the other priorities of life and just trying to make sure that we give all of them equal time. It's like, no, God is priority one, and out of that flows all of this as I learn to walk well as a disciple of Jesus.
So if you're a family who hasn't done this particularly well or can see room for improvement, where do you start? Where would you start?
Yeah, I would say first you start by modeling it. You start by prioritizing Christ in your life in a way that kids can see it, in a way that it impacts your conversations with them in the car, around life, that Jesus is not a part of it, but Jesus is in the mix and the thread that weaves through all of it. that you prioritize things that will put your kids in spaces where they are being impacted for Christ, both internally in your house, but then like, again, I always, I know I get pushback on this. I know there's people who don't like it when I say this, but ultimately, like if you're going to say gymnastics is super important and it's more important than having my kids engaged in Christian community, why would you at all be surprised that as your kids grow up, they're like, yeah, well, Jesus isn't exactly a priority. Like there's a lot of other things that top that in my life. Like, again, I'm willing to be proven wrong, but I have had like 20 plus years of experience dealing with families and dealing with children now, where I've never talked to a parent that says, you know, I'm so glad I just really prioritized gymnastics or hockey or something else in the life of my kid and took them away from Christian community so often.
And like as a sports mom,
Yeah.
so the girls are pretty heavily involved in sports. We've had to make the decision as how we lead them through this. So conversations in our home look like how you train for excellence.
Yep.
They have natural God-given gifts of being good athletes. So how are they going to steward those gifts well? But it's changing the conversations. It's not like you go to sport and that's it. Jesus isn't a part of it. It's like changing the conversation of how they can reflect the truth of Christ that they've proclaimed to hold. And so how does that change as an athlete? So how do you be an athlete who loves Jesus, love your teammates well?
Yeah. How do you be an athlete who like your winning and losing doesn't define your identity?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's radically countercultural.
It is. And there's so like sport parents are faced in that push and pull kind of, but we have a responsibility as Christian sport parents to disciple our kids well in all aspects, not just as children, but children who play sports competitively. And those conversations we have to be more intentional about. So I think there's a way to do it.
Yeah. It's hard.
It's hard. And you have to be really mindful about it.
I'll give you another thing for us as our kids have grown up. You know, one of the things we ground our kids from some stuff at times. There's punishments, but one of the things that we say is we're never going to ground our kids from going to youth ministry.
Yep.
That like there'll be a grounding, but it doesn't seem like this makes a great sense to say, you know, you really love youth ministry, so you're not going to go spend time hearing about Jesus. It's probably the one thing you need a little bit more right now. It just means when you go home, there's going to be 3 days without any Xbox or phone or screens.
Means you're showing up 30 minutes early to set up for you.
But I did grow up in a setting where I had friends and again, their parents were believers, but like, oh, that's the thing they really like, so we're going to take that away from them.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that, yeah, like I've spent many years in youth ministry and had the exact same conversation with parents of taking away youth night, which because they love it. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, but whatever. But I think on this, as we talk about, as Derek just said, and Rachel, as you guys have just said, of a lot of this comes down to the parent of who you are as you're guiding your kids. And I'll just point this out. I think that our children remember what we celebrate and what we sacrifice. These are two things. If you're wanting to see like what your children are going to remember, if you celebrate, if you put as the highest prize, highest grades, your team wins whatever the game or the entire season, whatever you celebrate, they're going to remember that. And so it's amazing to me of how many Christian parents, well-meaning, who just so prioritize and just drive it into their kids. You got to get into a certain university with a certain GPA to get a certain job because you have to make a certain amount of money. And this, like, you have to do it. And church is okay.
Yeah.
We like Jesus too. And I'm like, are you celebrating the thing that like is the most ultimate thing? And like, we can all agree that good grades is great, but how can you celebrate our relationship with Christ even higher than that? And then on the other side is sacrifice. So I know an amazing mom and dad, parents who they just told their kids just flat out, like, we know that you love hockey, but it's consistently in the way of us participating in the life of the church. And so you can still play hockey, but just not on this team. You're going to play local in town, but you're not going to be traveling anymore. And they told him this 3 years before they pulled the trigger on it. Right? Just so you know, you got 3 years left, 2 years left, 1 year, enjoy it, 1 year left. And we know that this is a sacrifice on you guys, but we see where this team is leading us to. And so we're going to stop it at a certain point. And I'm like, that's amazing that their kids are they're going to remember that their parents made a hard decision and walk them through understanding it, of why they made that decision. Hockey isn't bad, but what is bad is if it keeps you out 5 or 6 nights a week away from and I'm not just talking about Sunday mornings, the life of the church.
Yeah.
So I think these are things that will really drive it home for our kids.
Yeah, I think, and that celebrating thing is key, Daryl, and it's beyond the activities that you participate in. Like, what do we celebrate in the lives of our kids and their achievements? Do we celebrate that they are growing in love and kindness towards those who aren't easy to love or aren't shown love by many people in the world? Like, what types of qualities are you celebrating Christian virtues in the life of your child, or are you celebrating the types of things that our culture celebrates in terms of what we view as achievement and success? That's, we have to define for our kids what success really looks like as one who is following after Jesus.
Well, and so this question came into, and it is perfect timing for it. You spoke, Derek, about seeking Jesus as being more important than our grades or accolades or whatever. So how do you go about doing it? I think I know the answer, but I'll let you speak into it. There's a way. If we don't know Jesus, if we don't know him intimately and ultimately, we're not going to be able to teach our kids that. So seeking Jesus is more important.
Yeah, it's a lot of what we've already talked about. It is this reality that, do we really believe, like, not just when we sit down to write the test out, not just when we're giving people the answers to a quiz, but do we really believe that eternal life is through Christ and Christ alone? And eternal life is not just life in the future, but meaningful, purposeful life, the life we were designed for, created for, placed in the garden to enjoy an intimate relationship with God in the here and now as well. That life is ultimately only found through Jesus. And then reflecting on, does my life reflect those values? Does what I give my time to, does what I give my money to, does what I put as the focal point, did those reflect that value in such a way that my life's preaching it?
And how do we build those practices in? So what are first steps, next steps, best steps to actually putting the pursuit of knowing Jesus as our first thing?
Yeah, some of it is, what do you talk about? Like, what are the things that come out of your mouth? Are you spending time in the Word of God regularly? Are you spending time in prayer regularly? When you do these things, they do tend to flow out of you. It does tend to come up in conversation. Your faith, some of you have heard this before, but faith is much caught as taught. So there's teaching that's important, and there's creating spaces we've talked about for them to be in places where they can learn about Jesus, for you to teach about Jesus in your home. But some of it is just you faithfully following Jesus and modeling that out. Yeah.
Don't we got to add to that?
Yeah, just so much what Dirk has already said. I'll put it this way. So in our home, this is just gonna shock you guys. We don't watch a whole lot of sports, and to my great shame, my kids can't remember for the life of them what any sport is.
Daddy, put on the sports ball again.
A baseball to Natalie, a baseball is a basketball, and to Parker, football is soccer. Like all of it, like
football and soccer. That I can get. I get that one.
Like they know nothing.
Yeah.
And I I'll purpose start trying to like teach them like what sports are, because there's just a huge knowledge gap in their minds. And it's not as though like we're amazing parents, but
It's going to be hard for you to teach that because you don't care about it.
it's not a huge priority to me, but I'm so amazed at like when I'm putting Parker to sleep at night that like he would just be talking about, like, he just have questions about God and questions about life. And that to me is amazing of him bringing these things up. And so it's so much of the emphasis within the home. And in the same way, where like if we're living in our home and God is just not a priority, just our expectation has to be then that our kids are just not going to put things together. Like we can just assume that they'll just figure this out, but it takes so much time and emphasis on our part. Like we really have to model this, and so it's everything what Derek just said. Like you have to be modeling this both in what you're reading, what you're talking about. Are you on a serve team? Like, are you actively participating in the life of the church? Just showing your kids like, this is where I'm using my gifting towards and in building up the church to point others back to Jesus. Like all these things just add up to such a powerful message.
I would like to, Rachel, just speak to some people who this is going to be difficult for and difficult to hear, because I know there'll be people who are looking now and they've started following just later and they're like, I mean, I haven't been able to do that. Maybe my kids are old, or maybe my kids are grown now. I just want to first of all say to you, God's grace is sufficient. He's not holding you. He doesn't want to hold you in shame and in bondage to shame over what hasn't been done in the past. You walk faithfully with Jesus right now, even if your kids are grown, that they would begin to see the transformation that takes place in your life, that you would live openly and authentically, so that they could see how the way that Jesus is impacting you and changing you. That's still powerful. For those who maybe are like, I did all that and God didn't come through on his end of the bargain. Because we can feel like this is where we can fall into our own health and wealth gospel. This is where we can fall into our own, I do this, God does this, right? And God is kind of more a magic formula than he is creator and sovereign over all things. It's not a promise that you do these things and everything turns out right. We can find lots of people in Scripture. Samuel's sons were terrible. Samuel loved Jesus. So many of the kings that came from the line of David were awful, despite the fact there was some, there was a godly heritage where things started. That's not to discourage anybody. That's just to say what you can do now after you have planted the seed, after you've done all that you can do, is pray. And continue to pray over your kids, continue to walk faithfully with the Lord in your own life, and trust in the goodness and grace of God to do what he will do.
Yep.
And I think with that, there is power in that prayer and in the process of if you feel like you've made mistakes along the way, and which parent hasn't, like there's real power in repentance.
Absolutely.
But both for our own soul and for our children as they grow up, that they would see their parents repenting both to God and even to their own kids, where you can just say, hey, I made this decision and I can honestly say it wasn't the right call. Can you forgive me? And you can say that to a young child or to your child who's now grown and out of the home. And that might not change anything in them, but really this is for our soul, that we would be, as Derek, as he just said, of just trusting God with our past and with our future.
It might be, I think this, in the way that I parented you and the way that we portrayed things, I'm worried that this is the type of picture I painted of God for you. And that's the type of picture that I had at the time, but I've come to know that God is so much more than that he is so gracious and compassionate and kind and forgiving. And I just want to say sorry if this is the type of picture that I painted in your mind about who God is. There's a God who loves you, and I would love for you to know him more deeply.
Yeah, and nothing shows more humility than going, I'm sure, to your adult children or children in general to say, I'm sorry, I did you wrong.
Yeah.
And it takes a lot of humility for a child to say to their parent that they forgive them as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It takes a lot.
we can learn so much from Jesus. I don't even think half of the time we grasp very much of it, but we are all at works in progress and can grow in our knowledge both of him and how we display that to others. As we wrap up today, is there any last words of encouragement or thoughts you would love to leave with our listeners today? Daryl, start with you.
Yeah, I just want to give just this encouragement of seeing that as our knowledge of God, as that increases, how much that Christ can transform our lives. Like that's the one thing as we think through this whole idea of knowledge and wisdom and what are we pursuing after is that trusting that as we learn more about him, that we're trusting that he is working deeply in our lives to make us more and more into his image. And so really that's my hope as we study a passage like this and as we have this conversation, that is where God is leading us. And we know that is where he will lead us to.
For me, I would encourage us to be people who pursue wisdom and knowledge, but placed under Christ. So I've been thinking a lot lately about how when we pursue like knowledge of the physical world, if we're pursuing it under God, it leads us to a sense of wonder. Wow, God, what a creative God you are. What a powerful God you are. When I'm a big history buff, I've been listening to a couple episodes of history. This is how big of a history buff I am. I'm listening to a couple episodes on 1974 England. It's just fascinating to me. But what I realize every time I'm looking through history is I'm looking at it through the lens of what do we learn about human beings? What do we learn about their nature and their need for God, and how those needs continue to repeat, and how Jesus is the ultimate answer to all these things. And so knowledge placed under Christ is incredibly important and incredibly valuable, and God can use that. But don't just distract yourself with the pursuit of knowledge, of just trivia and knowing knowledge for knowledge's sake, or even worse, using it to puff yourself up in your own pride and ego. Pursue Christ more than anything.
One of my favorite rhythms that I've been working through, it's almost been a year and a half now, but I listen to a gospel chapter, 3 chapters every single day. And in the opening of it, it says, you don't need to spend every day in the Gospels, but every day in the Gospels, you will learn about Jesus more. And it has been true in this last year of me learning that, is that every day I'm in the Gospels, I grow closer in that knowledge of Christ and knowing who he was and what his character was like. And it has transformed a lot for me just to know him more intimately in that way. And so there are ways that we can grow in Christ every day, even more just knowing what his nature and character is like. So challenge you to do the same. That's what we're growing in our knowledge of Christ and what he has done for us. That's it. I want to point out one class I didn't ask you guys, but we have a new Equip class starting on the 20th. And I think for those parents listening, this might be a good next step for them to engage in. We've got a parenting class. It's called Navigating the Public School System.
The teacher's all right too.
The teacher, I like her.
She's pretty great.
It's Amanda. Amanda's teaching.
It's my wife. And I will be operating the Zoom.
Nice.
Because I know we have like over 20 people on Zoom signed up for that class. And so I want to make sure that, because we are going to be taking questions from those who are a part of it to help make sure that we're answering the things that parents are wondering and struggling with.
Yeah. So if that is a class that would benefit you and your family, you can still register online for church.ca under upcoming events through the Church Center app, and just use that as a tool to help you grow as a parent who loves Jesus and loves their kids. Next week, we are continuing on in our sermon series, week 3. It's called If It Makes You Happy. I was going to sing it, but I didn't want to. So tune in. I
would love it if you would. But
no, you guys can Google Sheryl Crow and you'll be able to listen to it on your own. But that's where we're going. If It Makes You Happy, Ecclesiastes 2, verses 1 through 11. Give it a read before you join us on Sunday, and then we'll see you back here on the Rewind podcast next week. Bye for now, friends.